In this video, we want to talk about something that we pretty much eat every day, and humans have been using it for an extremely long time. When you think about salt, you're imagining some type of food next to it, or the same thing that makes this seawater salty and makes it undrinkable. This is the formula for salt, sodium chloride, and this is what you use and what you put on your food. If you didn't already know, salt is a mineral, and it's the only mineral we eat. And the funny part is, we actually need it inside our body, but not too much of it. Salt, just like saffron, other spices, and gold, it was an extremely important factor in trading. So you're saying you traded salt like you traded gold back in the day? Yes, because it was a very important good you needed back then, and everybody wanted salt. And the problem is, you couldn't find it everywhere. There is a lot of saying about salts. But as you know, salt is not only to make food taste better, it's also good when you put it on food to prevent it from rotting. Until recent time, we have invented the fridge. Back then, there was no refrigerator unless you lived in the Antarctic or North Pole, so you couldn't keep food for a long period of time. And that is why you would bury it with salt to prevent it from rotting. So why does the salt prevent the food from rotting? It's because it drinks up all the water, and when there's no water, bacteria doesn't grow there, and that prevents it from rotting. Back then, this is how they treated meat. You couldn't keep all the meat to yourself, so you dried it out and created jerky. But nowadays, it's different. They actually dry out the meat and create the modern beef jerky. But it was the same idea, and unlike regular meat, jerky can stay on the shelf for a very long time. You need a good amount of salt inside your body as well. If the salt levels are low inside your body, you will feel nauseous and have a headache and just not feel good overall. But if you have too much salt in your blood, everybody knows what this causes: high blood pressure. Right now, when you need salt, you go to the store and just buy it. And relative to the other stuff you can buy, it's much cheaper. But it wasn't always like this. In ancient times, in most areas of the planet, you couldn't find salt, and you would have to bring it from other places. The people that lived next to the ocean or seas that had salt in it, they could grab the water from there, boil it, and basically take the salt from there. The ones that lived next to a salt mine or salt flats or fields, they could take the salt from there. But what about the rest of the places? They had to bring the salt from elsewhere, and that would raise up the price of the product. And the people of that area had a hard time buying salt. The Chinese always had a shortage of salt. That is why they always took the ocean water and took out the water so they can get to the salt. They didn't do this in a normal way. They actually had factories to evaporate the salt water and just take the salt from it. And this was happening around 4,700 years ago. Quite impressive if you ask me. Historians believe the first form of tax was created by the Chinese using salt. The Chinese economy back then was dependent on salt. After the Chinese did it, the Egyptians also followed along, but they didn't take the salt water. They actually had salt flats and salt fields they could take from. So for the Egyptians, salt was much cheaper than the Chinese. Not only did the Egyptians use the salt for their food, but they also used it to prevent their food from spoiling. And they were one of the very first people to do this. And it's interesting to know, they also did this with their mummies. Of course, they mixed other stuff with it, but salt was the main ingredient that prevented the body from rotting. The Europeans didn't know much about salt until we get to the ancient Roman Empire. They learned from the Egyptians that they could take salt water and boil it and get the salt out of it. In ancient times, there were a lot of wars over salt. Like Venice fought Genoa over salt, and Venice was victorious. Salt also had a lot to do with the American Revolutionary War. It's funny you should know that in the south of Spain, there was a salt mine, and the income of that mine helped the Spanish emperor to send Christopher Columbus to the Americas. Back in the day, there were a tremendous amount of taxes over salt. And like we said, the Chinese were the first people to create such an idea. What about iodine salt? As you know, iodine is an element on the periodic table, and it's a mineral we need inside our body. But just like anything, too much of it is not good for us. So that doesn't mean that everybody should eat iodine salt. If you have low iodine in your blood, you should eat this type of salt. And how do you check if you have low iodine? With a blood test. So don't eat iodine salt for no reason. In ancient Rome, salt was so valuable that the soldiers that fought for the empire were paid in salt. In Latin, sal means salt, and of course we get salt from sal. And the term salary comes from sal, or the meaning in Latin, salt. In religious texts, there's a lot of good things to say about salt. Like a mountain of salt is a symbol for high value. In the Bible, when they talk about an amazing structure, they say the pillars are made from salt. That shows us how important salt is that they even talk about it in religious texts. In the human body of an average person, there's about 250 grams of salt. And if you want to imagine how much that is, that's about 4 average-sized salt shakers. But it can be more than this, or less than this. Some doctors say if you have an average amount of salt, it doesn't actually hurt you to have a little bit less, and it helps you have a healthier blood pressure and heart. But everybody knows this sea, the Dead Sea. And it's literally dead. There's so much salt in this lake that when they measured it, it has 10 times the salt you'll find in the ocean. And for that reason, you cannot find a living thing in this water. Another interesting fact you should know that in the US, the most amount of salt is not used for eating. It's meant for icy roads, and the salt that's put on the road during the winter makes the car rot out quickly. Like for example, cars that drive in the northeast of the United States, after a few years, they're completely destroyed by salt. But if you're in the south side of the US, especially west-south like California, the cars are more valuable because the chances of them rusting out is extremely slim. Another interesting thing you should know about salt is that this is the formula of salt, like we said earlier. These two elements by themselves are actually quite dangerous. Sodium is an alkali metal and it could be extremely explosive, and chlorine can be very dangerous in gas form. But when you put these two dangerous elements together, they make up something we use every day: salt.